The Colonial Era in American History. Introduction. The colonial era of American history spans roughly from 1607, when the first permanent English settlement was established at Jamestown, Virginia, to 1776, when the 13 colonies declared independence from Great Britain. During these nearly 2 centuries, a patchwork of European colonies took root along the Atlantic seaboard of North America, evolving from precarious outposts into a diverse and increasingly self-assured society. This period laid the economic, political, religious, and cultural foundations of what would become the United States. Understanding the colonial era means examining the motives that drove European settlement, the experiences of the people who built these colonies, including enslaved Africans and Native Americans, and the gradual development of ideas about self-governance that would eventually fuel a revolution. Early attempts and the founding of Jamestown. England's first attempts at colonization were largely failures. The Roanoke colony, established in 1585 on the coast of present-day North Carolina, famously vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the word Croton carved into a post. It would take 2 more decades before England achieved a lasting foothold in the New World. In 1607, the Virginia Company of London sponsored an expedition that established Jamestown, named after King James I. The settlers who arrived were often ill-suited for the harsh realities of colonial life. Many were gentlemen unaccustomed to manual labor, and the swampy location they chose was rife with disease and poor drinking water. The starving time of 1609 to 1610 nearly wiped out the colony entirely, with survivors reduced to eating rats, leather, and in some desperate cases, resorting to cannibalism. Jamestown's fortunes changed with the cultivation of tobacco. John Rolfe's experiments with a milder strain of tobacco created a cash crop that could be sold profitably in Europe, and by the 1620s, Virginia's economy was built around it. This success came at a cost. The labor-intensive nature of tobacco farming created enormous demand for workers, which was initially met through indentured servitude and increasingly, by the mid to late 17th century, through the enslavement of Africans. The arrival of the first Africans in Virginia in 1619, brought aboard a Dutch ship, marked the beginning of a slave system that would come to define much of colonial and later American life, particularly in the southern colonies. The Puritans and New England. While Virginia was founded primarily for economic gain, the colonies of New England were shaped significantly by religious motives. In 1620, a group of English separatists, commonly known today as the Pilgrims, sailed aboard the Mayflower and established Plymouth Colony in present-day Massachusetts. Before disembarking, the colony's leaders drafted the Mayflower Compact, an agreement establishing a rudimentary framework of self-government based on the consent of the governed. Though modest in scope, this document is often cited as an early seed of American democratic thought. A decade later, a much larger and better-funded group of Puritans arrived under the leadership of John Winthrop, founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Winthrop's famous sermon, delivered aboard the ship Arbella, described the colony as a city upon a hill, a phrase that would echo through American political rhetoric for centuries. The Puritans sought to create a godly society governed by strict religious principles, and while they had fled persecution in England, they were often intolerant of dissent within their own community. Figures like Roger Williams and Hutchinson were banished for challenging Puritan orthodoxy. Williams went on to found Rhode Island, a colony that became known for its unusual commitment to religious liberty and separation of church and state. New England's economy differed markedly from the South's. The rocky soil and cold climate were poorly suited to large-scale cash crop agriculture, so New Englanders turned to fishing, shipbuilding, timber, and trade. Towns were often organized around a central meeting house and an emphasis on literacy, driven by the Puritan desire for individuals to read the Bible, led to the early establishment of schools and, in 1636, Harvard College. The Middle Colonies, diversity and commerce. Between New England and the southern colonies lay the Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. This region was notable for its ethnic and religious diversity. New York began as the Dutch colony of New Netherland, centered on the port of New Amsterdam, before England seized it in 1664 and renamed it after the Duke of York. Dutch, English, German, and other European settlers mingled there, along with a substantial population of enslaved Africans. Pennsylvania, founded in 1681 by William Penn, a Quaker, was conceived as a holy experiment in religious tolerance. Penn's policies attracted a wide range of settlers, including Quakers, German Mennonites, Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and others fleeing persecution or seeking opportunity. Philadelphia rapidly grew into one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the colonies, prized for its fertile farmland and bustling port. The middle colonies became known as the breadbasket of colonial America, exporting wheat and other grains. The southern colonies and the plantation system. South of Virginia, the colonies of Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia developed economies heavily reliant on cash crops, tobacco in the Chesapeake region, and rice and indigo further south. Maryland, founded in 1632 by Cecilius Calvert, Lord Baltimore, was intended partly as a refuge for English Catholics, though it soon became religiously mixed, prompting the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649, one of the first laws in the colonies to mandate religious tolerance for Christians. The Carolinas, chartered in 1663, developed a plantation economy centered on rice cultivation in the low-country swamps, a labor system that relied heavily on the specialized agricultural knowledge enslaved West Africans brought with them. Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies to be founded in 1732, was established by James Oglethorpe Hartley as a philanthropic buffer colony against Spanish Florida, initially banning slavery, though this prohibition was reversed within 2 decades under pressure from settlers seeking to replicate the profitable plantation model seen elsewhere. By the 18th century, the institution of slavery had become deeply entrenched throughout the southern colonies, with enslaved Africans and their descendants making up a significant percentage of the population in colonies like South Carolina and Virginia. Slave codes restricted the movements, education, and rights of enslaved people, and the system was maintained through both law and brutal violence. This period also saw resistance, from everyday acts of defiance to organized uprisings such as the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina. Relations with Native Americans. European colonization had catastrophic consequences for the indigenous peoples who had lived on the continent for thousands of years before European arrival. Diseases such as smallpox, to which native populations had no immunity, devastated communities, sometimes killing the majority of a tribe's population before conflict even began. Beyond disease, colonization brought displacement, warfare, and the steady erosion of native land and autonomy. Relations varied by region and era. Early Jamestown settlers depended on trade and, at times, tense diplomacy with the Powhatan Confederacy, while conflicts like the Anglo-Powhatan Wars underscored the fragility of these arrangements. In New England, the Pequot War, 1636 to 1638, and King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, the latter named after the Wampanoag leader Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, were devastating conflicts that resulted in significant loss of life on both sides and further diminished native power in the region. As colonial populations grew and expanded westward, competition for land intensified, setting patterns of conflict and displacement that would continue well beyond the colonial period. Governance and the seeds of self-rule. Despite their differences, the 13 colonies developed patterns of governance that fostered a degree of local autonomy unusual within the British Empire. Most colonies had a governor, often appointed by the crown or a proprietor, alongside an elected assembly that controlled local taxation and legislation. The Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619, was the first elected legislative body in the American colonies, setting a precedent for representative government that would spread throughout British North America. This tradition of self-governance was reinforced by the practical reality that Britain, for much of the 17th and early 18th centuries, exercised only loose oversight of its American colonies, a period sometimes called salutary neglect. Colonists grew accustomed to managing their own local affairs, electing their own representatives, and levying their own taxes, even as they remained legally subject to the British Crown and Parliament. Religion, the Great Awakening, and intellectual life. Religious life in the colonies was far from static. By the 1730s and 1740s, a wave of Protestant revivalism known as the Great Awakening swept through the colonies. Preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards drew massive crowds with emotionally charged sermons emphasizing personal conversion and a direct relationship with God, challenging the authority of established churches and clergy. The movement cut across colonial boundaries, contributing to a shared sense of identity among colonists from Massachusetts to Georgia, even as it also created lasting divisions between traditional and evangelical congregations. Alongside this religious ferment, the Enlightenment brought new ideas about reason, natural rights, and government to colonial thinkers. Figures such as Benjamin Franklin embodied this intellectual spirit, engaging in scientific experimentation, civic improvement, and philosophical inquiry. These ideas about natural rights and the proper limits of governmental power would later prove central to the arguments colonists made against British rule. The French and Indian War and its aftermath. The mid-18th century brought the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, the North American theater of the broader global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. Britain and its colonial forces, together with some native allies, fought against France and its own native allies for control of contested territory, particularly in the Ohio River Valley. Britain's eventual victory, confirmed by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, resulted in France ceding nearly all of its North American territory. Though victorious, Britain emerged from the war deeply in debt and looked to its American colonies to help shoulder the financial burden. This led to a series of new taxes and regulations, including the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts, that colonists increasingly viewed as violations of their traditional rights, particularly the principle of no taxation without representation. The war had also demonstrated to many colonists that they could organize and fight effectively, while simultaneously exposing tensions between colonial militias and British regular forces. Conclusion. By the eve of the American Revolution, the 13 colonies had developed distinct regional identities shaped by differing economies, religious traditions, and social structures. Yet they also shared a growing sense of common cause rooted in their experiences under British rule. The colonial era was a time of extraordinary transformation. Fragile settlements grew into thriving towns and cities. Diverse peoples, English, Dutch, German, Scots-Irish, African, and indigenous, shaped a new and often contradictory society that proclaimed ideals of liberty while simultaneously building an economy on the institution of slavery. The political habits of self-governance cultivated over generations, combined with new Enlightenment ideas about natural rights, would soon give colonists the confidence and the language to challenge the authority of the British Crown altogether. In this sense, the colonial era was not merely a prelude to the Revolution. It was the crucible in which the ideas, institutions, and contradictions of the future United States were first forged.